"This inheritance is for real family," my stepson Noah said, his voice dripping with a smug certainty that chilled the entire conference room. He looked right through me, like I was a ghost already. I just let a small, slow smile spread across my face and slid the crisp, white envelope across the polished mahogany table. It's strange how your whole life can be condensed in a single moment. Just a few weeks before that, I was Mrs. Audrey Pierce, living in a sun-drenched penthouse overlooking Central Park. For 5 years, my life with Marcus had been a dream I never wanted to wake up from. He was my rock, my confidant, my entire world. The age difference never mattered. His love made me feel timeless. Our home wasn't just an apartment, it was a sanctuary, filled with the scent of old books from his library and the quiet hum of a life built on mutual trust. I believed I was the luckiest woman in New York. When the call came about his heart attack, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under the world. The silence he left behind was deafening, a physical weight in every room. Grief is a clean, sharp hurts, but you understand. What Noah did afterward, however, that was a different kind of wound. It was a slow-acting poison. He saw me as a gold digger, a final, foolish mistake his father had made. He had no idea who I really was. He had no clue about the secret I'd carried since I was 16, a secret that bound us together in a way he could never imagine. He thought he was taking back his legacy. He was about to find out he was just a pawn in a story that began long before he was born. This is the story of how I uncovered a decades-old secret buried in the heart of my own marriage. It's a twisted and painful story, and telling it means reliving every single lie. To make it to the end, I'm going to need a friend listening. If you want to see how it all unravels, you can follow the stories told. That way, you won't miss what happened next. The days after the funeral were a blur of casseroles I couldn't eat, and sympathetic whispers that felt like sandpaper on my raw nerves. The penthouse, our sanctuary, suddenly felt like a gilded, each room echoing with a silence that was louder than any sound. I kept expecting to hear Marcus's key in the door, to smell the coffee he brewed every morning, to feel his hand on the small of my back as I looked out over the city. But there was nothing, and the ghost of our life. The call from the lawyer came about a week later. I walked into that downtown office expecting closure, a finality. I thought the reading of the will would be a sad but simple affair. Marcus had always been clear with Audrey, he'd say, his voice warm and reassuring. "This home is our home. You are my wife. You will always be safe." I believed him. I never once thought to question it. Noah was already there, sitting beside a man I'd never seen before. A lawyer with a shark smile and eyes that were 2 chips of ice. My heart sank a little. Marcus's lawyer for over 20 years was a kind, fatherly man named Mr. Abernathy. This new man, Mr. Graves, radiated an aggressive energy that felt all wrong. He read through the main will, and it was mostly as I expected. Charitable donations, a few bequests to old friends. And then he cleared his throat and picked up a separate, thinner stack of papers. An addendum, he called it, dated just 3 months before Marcus's death. My hands started to tremble in my lap. As Graves read the clinical, brutal language, the floor fell away again. The penthouse, the art collection, the majority of the liquid assets, everything was to be transferred to a trust managed by and for his sole blood heir, Noah. I was left with a sum of money that, while not insignificant, was a calculated insult. It was just enough to pack my bags and disappear quietly. I remember Noah putting a hand on my arm as I sat there, stunned into silence. He had the nerve to tell me he was so sorry, that his father must have had a late change of heart, wanting to protect the family legacy. He said the money was to help me transition, to get back on my... He said it with a look of such that it made me want to scream. The message was clear. Your fairy tale is over. I left that office in the city lights blurring through my tears. I stumbled back into the apartment that was no longer mine and sank onto the floor of our closet, burying my face in Marcus's old sweaters, trying to find a scent of him, of the man I thought I knew. Had he lied to me for 5 years? Was our entire life, our love, just a temporary arrangement he never intended to make permanent? The thought was a physical pain, worse than the grief itself. For 2 days, I let that pain consume me, replayed every conversation, every promise, searching for a hint of deception. I found nothing. And then something started to nag at me. A tiny, insignificant detail. Mr. Abernathy. Why wasn't he there? On the 3rd day, with a new and unfamiliar feeling starting to bubble beneath the sorrow, I picked up the phone and called Abernathy's old firm. A polite receptionist answered. I asked to speak to him, and she told me, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Abernathy retired over 6 months. He moved to Florida." My blood ran cold. 6 months ago. But that wasn't right. I searched my memory, my mind suddenly sharp. I remembered Marcus coming home late one Tuesday night. He'd tossed his keys into the bowl by the door and kissed me, his jacket still smelling faintly of the expensive cigar smoke from the steakhouse. I'd asked him how his dinner with Mr. Abernathy. He had laughed and told me the old man was on a new health kick, ordering salmon while he had the ribeye. It was a tiny detail, a lie so small, so seemingly pointless. Why would Noah and his new lawyer lie about when Abernathy retired? Why invent a new man if everything was legitimate? Standing there in the silent apartment, the grief that had clouded my mind for days began to recede. It was replaced by a single, sharp, and terrifying thought. The signature on that addendum might have looked like my husband's, but the story surrounding it was a lie. And in that moment, I knew. Marcus hadn't betrayed me. Someone else had. That single, misplaced memory about the steakhouse dinner was the spark. It lit a fire in the cold, hollow space where the sorrow was still there, a constant ache behind my ribs. But now, a cold, sharp-edged anger that gave me focus for the first time since Marcus's death. I knew I was on borrowed time. Noah and his shark, Mr. Graves, were likely watching me, waiting for me to pack my things and vanish. They expected tears and a quiet exit. That was my advantage. So I began to perform. By day, I was the broken widow. I dutifully sorted through photo albums at the kitchen table, letting Noah see me cry when he stopped by with more boxes. I spoke to him in a soft, defeated voice, telling him I was making arrangements to stay with a friend upstate. He'd nod, his face a perfect mask of sympathy, telling me to take my time, that there was no rush. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it made my skin crawl. But at night, when the city was asleep and the building was quiet, the real work began. My search started in the one place that felt most like him, his study. The room was my favorite in the entire apartment, lined with dark mahogany shelves, smelling of old paper, leather, and the faint, spicy scent of his cologne that still clung to the air. Closing the heavy doors behind me, I felt a pang of guilt. It felt like a betrayal, searching for secrets in the heart of his private world. But the thought of Noah's smug face pushed 3 nights. I searched. I went through every drawer in his antique desk, every file in his heavy metal cabinets. It was all meticulously organized. Business contracts, tax records from a decade ago, blueprints for a building he'd designed in his youth. It was the complete, orderly history of a man's life. But there was nothing. No mention of a new lawyer, no draft of an addendum, nothing to suggest a change of heart. I started to feel a creeping dread. What if I was wrong? What if grief had made me paranoid, and Marcus really had cut me out of his life in his final days? On the 4th night, I stood in the middle of the room, ready to give up. My eyes scanned the shelves, the desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and then they landed on the painting. It was a massive oil painting of a clipper ship on a stormy sea, hung directly behind his desk. It was the first piece of art we'd bought together on a trip to Nantucket. I looked at it every day. But that night, I saw it different. Almost invisible scratch on the deep blue wallpaper, right next to the ornate gold frame. It was a fresh mark, as if the heavy painting had been taken down and not put back in the exact same spot. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. With trembling hands, I dragged his heavy leather chair over and climbed onto it. The painting was heavier than I expected. I struggled, my fingers straining, until it finally lifted off its hook. We dropped it, and there, behind it, was a gray metal square, flush with the wall, almost perfectly camouflaged. A safe. I felt a dizzying mix of terror, and he never told me about it. I tried the codes I could think of. Our anniversary, his birthday, Noah's. The keypad flashed red with each failure. Defeated, I slumped against the desk, my mind racing. What else mattered to him? And then, a sad memory surfaced. Quiet night, a glass of whiskey in his hand, when he told me about the day his first wife, Eleanor, had died. He'd spoken the date in a whisper. With nothing to lose, I climbed back on the chair and punched in the numbers. A soft beep and a green light. The heavy door clicked open. Inside there wasn't much. Some of Eleanor's jewelry, a few old bonds, and a thin leather folio. My hands shook as I opened it. The first page was a doctor. My eyes scanned the words but used to process them at first. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, term. The diagnosis was days ago. He had known. He had known he was dying, pain of that sequel blow. But beneath the report was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Mr. Abernathy. My eyes flew across the page, his familiar script. He wrote about his diagnosis, his decision not to tell me to spare me and then he wrote about Noah. He described his son as having a voracious appetite for money and a troubling lack of empathy. He expressed a deep, terrifying that Noah would try to contest the will, to seize control, to throw me out. The letter was an instruction to Abernathy. Create an unbreakable trust for Audrey. He wanted me to have the penthouse, the art, enough to live the rest of my life in comfort and safety. His final words on the page were, "Protect her. She is my world." The letter was dated 1 week before the fraudulent addendum was signed. The truth hit me with the force of a physical impact. My tears weren't for the lost inheritance. They were for my husband, who had faced death alone to protect me. And they were for the horrifying, soul-crushing realization that the boy Marcus had raised, the boy I had tried to care for, wasn't just a spoiled and greedy man. He was a monster who would prey on his own dying father. I sat on the floor of my husband's study for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in my hand, the cool leather of his chair pressed against my back as the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Each particle seemed to represent a secret I had been living amongst, completely unaware. The truth was a strange and bitter comfort. Marcus didn't betray me. He loved me. He had died trying to protect. That comfort was wrapped in a thick blanket of Noah's actions, the calculated deception. It was a darkness I couldn't have imagined. For a moment, I felt completely and utterly paralyzed. I had the truth in a letter, but what was that against a legal document? Against a team of ruthless lawyers? I was just a grieving widow. Who would believe me? The letter was addressed to Mr. Abernathy. He was the only other person who knew Marcus's true intentions. Noah and his lawyer had lied about him retiring. They had erased him from the picture. I realized then that finding him was my only next step. My initial search was fruitless. The old firm wouldn't give out any. There were no public order. It felt like he had vanished. For 2 days, I hit nothing but dead ends. I started to feel that old despair creeping back in. Then, I remembered something Marcus had sponsored a few years back, a charity gala for the city's Legal Aid Society. He had received an award, and the program, which I found tucked away in a memory box, listed the event's board members. Mr. Abernathy was on it, and so was his wife, Catherine. A quick search for Catherine Abernathy led me to a public social media profile. It was mostly pictures of her garden and her grandchildren. My heart ached looking at the images of their happy, normal life, a life Noah had threatened. One of the photos was of her and her husband, smiling, tagged at a small cafe in Brooklyn, posted only a week ago. Not Florida. He was hiding right here in the city. I found a number for their daughter and called, my voice shaking. I gave her a carefully edited version of the truth, telling her I was Marcus's widow, and I had an urgent personal message for her father regarding Marcus's final wishes. She was hesitant, but something in my voice must have convinced her. She agreed to pass along my number. 2 hours later, he called. His voice was tired, frail, not the confident and warm tone I remembered. He agreed to meet me, but his conditions were strict. A specific park bench in Queens the next day, midday. No one could know. The man I met on that bench looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. He was hunched, his eyes constantly scanning the people walking by. He told me his story in a hushed, broken voice, and I listened as the true, sickening depth of Noah's plan was revealed. He explained that Noah had shown up at his office, unannounced, about 4 months ago. He wasn't alone. Mr. Graves was with him. Noah had known everything about Marcus's diagnosis. Abernathy suspected he had been intercepting his father's mail. Noah laid out his demands simply. Abernathy was to retire immediately, hand over all of Marcus's files, and disappear. When Abernathy refused, Graves took over. He told me the lawyer had slid a file across the desk. It contained documents from a case 30 years ago, early in Abernathy's career. A mistake he had made, a detail he had overlooked, which he had rectified and tried to forget ever since. It wasn't illegal, but it was a serious ethical breach. Graves made it clear that if he didn't cooperate, that file would be sent to the State Bar Association. His career would be over, his reputation destroyed, his name dragged through the mud. But the final threat was what broke him. Graves had casually mentioned what a lovely daughter Abernathy had, and what a shame it would be if her husband's firm were to suddenly be subjected to a grueling and public financial audit. He confessed to me, his eyes filled with shame, that he had folded. He was a grandfather. He couldn't risk his family's security. He had signed a non-disclosure, packed up his office, and simply walked away, forced to allow them to perpetrate this fraud against his friend and clients. I left him on that park bench, a good man broken by a monster's greed. As I rode the subway back to Manhattan, the city rushing past the darkened windows, the scale of the betrayal settled over me. This wasn't just about an inheritance. This was a conspiracy built on blackmail, cruelty, and the emotional destruction of everyone who stood in Noah's way. He hadn't just forged a document, he had shattered lives. I walked back into the penthouse, our home, and looked at a photo of Marcus and me on our wedding. The sadness was still there, a deep cavern, but sitting with it now was a cold, hard stone of resolve. Noah hadn't just stolen my money. He had tried to steal my husband's legacy, his memory, his last act of love. He had tried to steal my future. And in that moment, I decided I wouldn't let him have a single piece of it. The time for crying was over. It was time to fight. The decision to fight is one thing. Figuring out how is something else entirely. I had Marcus's letter and the testimony of a terrified old man who had signed an NDA. In a courtroom, Noah's lawyer would tear that apart. He would paint me as a hysterical, vengeful widow. I couldn't attack head-on. My only advantage was Noah's perception of me. He saw a fragile, grieving woman, easily manipulated and soon to be forgotten. I had to become that woman. I had to wear her defeat like a costume until it was time to take it off. My strategy started with a phone call. I summoned a voice I didn't recognize as my own, one that was breathy and broken. I told Noah that I was overwhelmed with the process of packing up Marcus's personal effects, especially the things in his study. I asked if he could possibly come over and help me decide what to do with it all. I told him it was just too painful to do alone. The feigned helplessness in my voice was the bait. His ego, I suspected, was the hook. He agreed immediately, his tone dripping with the kind of condescending pity that had now become his signature. When he arrived at the penthouse the next afternoon, it was a cold, tight knot in my... I had to force my hands not to shake as I handed him a cup of coffee. I had to look into the eyes of the man who had plotted against his dying father and see only my stepson. It was the hardest performance of my life. We made small talk. I told him about my fictitious plans to move upstate. He told me it was for the best, that a fresh start would be good for... Every word was a lie, a carefully placed stone in the wall of deception we were building between us. I led him into the study. I let my eyes well up with tears as I gestured vaguely at the shelves. I told him I didn't know where to begin, especially with Marcus's rare book collection. I confessed that I knew they were valuable, but I had no idea how to even start the process of selling them. I asked for his advice, framing him as the savvy businessman who could help his poor, naive stepmother. He took the bait completely. He puffed up with an air of authority, striding over to the shelves and running his hand along the leather-bound spines. He told me that official auctions were a waste of time and money, riddled with fees and taxes. He explained that the best way was to go through a private dealer he knew, a man who could handle everything quietly and give me a fair, lump-sum price for the lot. It would be faster, easier, and cleaner for me, he assured me. He was so confident, so wrapped up in his own cleverness, that he got sloppy. He pulled a specific book from the shelf, a first edition of The Sun Also Rises. It was one of Marcus's most prized possessions. I knew for a fact that a collector had offered him a staggering amount for it just before he got sick. Noah held it in his hands, weighing it. He told me that this particular one, while beautiful, wasn't worth much. He went on to invent a story about how his father had always planned to donate it to his alma mater's library, so its value was purely sentimental. He advised me to just include it with the others for the private sale. The dealer might give me a few extra dollars for it out of kindness. And that was it. That was the mistake. My blood turned to ice in my veins, but I forced my face to remain a mask of sad, grateful acceptance. Because I had been there when the collector made the offer. I was standing right next to Marcus when he'd laughed and refused, telling the man that this book was his ace in the hole, his rainy day fund for our future. He would never have donated it. Noah's lie was so specific, so unnecessary. He could have just said it was valuable and let it be sold with the rest. But his greed was too precise. He wanted that specific book for himself. He had invented a lie to devalue it in my eyes, to ensure it would pass through his dishonest dealer and into his own hands for almost nothing. He left an hour later, convinced he had played me perfectly. He thought he was one step closer to liquidating every last piece of his father's life. But as I stood alone in the quiet study, running my fingers over the worn, embossed title of the Hemingway, I wasn't feeling helpless. I felt a surge of cold, electric clarity. He thought his lie was just another small piece of the puzzle, another way to cheat the grieving widow. But in his arrogance, he hadn't just told me a lie. He had given me a weapon. He had given me a name, the dealer, a concrete, provable falsehood. He had just handed me the first thread I needed to unravel his monstrous web. Noah's lie about the book was the first crack in his fortress. It wasn't just a lie. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I had a path to follow that he didn't know I was on. The private dealer he mentioned, that was my next target. I spent the next day playing the part of the dutiful widow, carefully wrapping porcelain figurines in tissue paper while my mind was racing, planning my first real move. I knew I couldn't investigate this man myself. A grieving widow asking questions about a rare book dealer would raise immediate red flags. This required a professional, someone who could move through the city's underbelly without a ripple. I used a portion of the money Marcus had left me, the money Noah had dismissed as a pittance, and I hired the best private investigator I could find. He was a former NYPD detective, a man with a quiet demeanor and eyes that seemed to see everything. I met him in a sterile, anonymous office, and I gave him the dealer's name, along with the names of Noah and Mr. Graves. I told him I suspected fraudulent activity related to my husband's estate. I didn't show him the letter. I didn't tell him about Mr. Abernathy. I kept my most powerful cards close to my chest. I just pointed him at the thread and let him pull. For a week, I heard nothing. It was the most agonizing 7 days of my life. I continued my performance, packing boxes, sighing with believable sadness whenever Noah called to check in. He was getting impatient. He kept asking when I would be moving out, his fake concern wearing thinner with each call. I told him I was finalizing things, that it was all so difficult. In reality, I was waiting, living on a knife's edge of hope and fear. Then the call came. The investigator had his report. When I opened the thick manila envelope he delivered, my world shifted on its axis once again. The first few pages confirmed what I suspected. The book dealer wasn't just a casual acquaintance, he and Noah were partners. The PI had unearthed business records for a shell corporation, founded 2 years prior, with 3 names on the documents: Noah Pierce, the book dealer, and the lawyer, Mr. Graves. Their business was listed as asset liquidation. They were a pack of wolves, and my husband's estate was their latest hunt. The report even detailed a similar situation from 18 months ago, a contested inheritance where Graves had represented the challenger, and this same dealer had been brought in to value and sell the assets for a fraction of their worth. This was a professional operation, but it was the final section of the report, the personal financial audit on Noah, that made me stop breathing. I had assumed this was all driven by simple, entitled. I was wrong. It was so much worse, so much more pathetic than that. The pages laid out a portrait of a man in absolute freefall. Noah was in debt, but not the way normal people are in debt. He was drowning in it. There were massive losses from high-risk stock market bets that had gone south. There were records of huge cash withdrawals from accounts linked to offshore sports betting sites. And most chillingly, there were copies of legal letters from aggressive, high-interest lenders, the kind of people who don't just take you to court when you default. The due dates on those loans were weeks away. He wasn't trying to get richer. He was trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship before it dragged him to the bottom. It all clicked into place. The desperation, the speed of his actions after Marcus's death, the need to liquidate everything so quickly and quietly. He wasn't just hungry for the money. He was terrified. He had likely been borrowing against his future inheritance for years, and now his creditors were coming to collect. His father's terminal diagnosis wasn't a tragedy, it was a deadline. I leaned back in my chair, the papers spread across the dining. The man I had seen as a cold, calculating monster was also a reckless, terrified. His cruelty wasn't born of strength, but of He had dismantled his dying father's final wishes, blackmailed an old man into silence, and tried to cast me out into the street, all to cover up his own stupid, greedy mistakes. The knowledge was sickening, but it was also a weapon. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a cornered animals make mistakes. He had built this elaborate scheme, this fortress of lies, but I had just been given the blueprints. I finally understood the why behind it all, and that told me exactly how to tear it all down. Knowing Noah's motivation was like seeing the enemy's battle plans. His desperation was his weakness, and I intended to use, but I couldn't do it alone. I had the puzzle pieces. The letter, the story from a terrified Mr. Abernathy, the private investigator's damning report, but I didn't know how to put them together to create a checkmate. I needed a lawyer, not a passive one, but a warrior. I called the investigator back. I told him I needed a recommendation for the best probate litigation in New York, specifically someone who wasn't afraid to go up against sharks like Mr. Graves. There was no hesitation in his voice. He gave me one name, Evelyn Davenport. He told me she was brilliant, relentless, and had a reputation for taking on the most complex and corrupt financial cases in the... He also told me she was incredibly selective about her clients. Getting a meeting wasn't easy, but I used the one thing I had, the Pierce family name. It still opened doors. I walked into her office on the 50th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper, a world away from the quiet grief of my apartment. The air hummed with a quiet, intimidating power. But I wasn't the same woman who had crumpled in a lawyer's office just a few weeks ago. My grief was now my armor. My purpose was my sword. Evelyn Davenport was exactly as the investigator had described. She had a sharp, intelligent gaze that seemed to dissect me as I sat down. I didn't start with emotion. I started with facts. I laid out the case with the same methodical precision I'd used in my own secret investigation. I presented the fraudulent addendum. I told her the story of Mr. Abernathy's forced retirement. I handed her the investigator's report, walking her through the Shell Corporation, the partnership between Noah, Graves, and the dealer. I pointed out the previous case they had been involved in. I explained Noah's crippling debt as the motive. She listened, her face a perfect, unreadable mask, her long fingers steepled under her chin. She read every page I gave her without interruption. When I was done, heavy silence filled the room. Finally, I played my last card. I took Marcus's letter from my purse and slid it across the vast, polished desk. I watched her eyes scan his familiar handwriting. I saw the slightest flicker of something in her expression as she read his final, desperate plea to protect me. When she finished, she looked up at me. She told me that I had a very strong case, but that it would be a brutal fight. She explained how Graves would try to bury us in motions, how he would drag my name through the mud, painting me as a gold-digging opportunist. She warned me that it could take years and cost a fortune. My heart began to sink, but then she picked up the PI's report again, tapping a single, manicured finger on one of the pages. The page that detailed the other case, the one from 18 months ago. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of a predatory smile. She told me she knew that name, the family from that other case a year ago, seeking justice. She explained that they had a similar story, a suspicious last-minute change to a will, an aggressive lawyer, and a collection of valuable assets that were sold off for pennies on the dollar by the same dealer. But they didn't have the evidence I had. They couldn't prove the conspiracy, the direct link between the lawyer and the dealer. They had been too afraid, too emotionally and financially drained to pursue a fight they weren't sure they could win. The air in the room suddenly felt electric. Ms. Davenport leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. She explained that my evidence changed everything. The PI's report, proving the existence of the Shell Corporation, was the missing piece. It elevated their scheme from a series of opportunistic civil offenses into a pattern of deliberate criminal conspiracy, racketeering. I had walked into that office hoping to find a lawyer to fight for my inheritance, but the path to my victory, I now realized, was not just about me. It was about them. My personal tragedy was the key to unlocking justice for another family, and more importantly, to building a case so strong it wouldn't just win me back my home. It could potentially land Noah in jail and get Mr. Graves disbarred for life. I left her office and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, but the world looked different. The fight was no longer a defensive one. We were on the offensive now. Noah and his crew hadn't just wronged a widow, they had made a career out of preying on the grieving and the vulnerable. And we were about to launch a hostile takeover of our own. The alliance with Evelyn Davenport and the other family, the Millers, transformed my solitary fight into a campaign. I met with them in a quiet corner of a hotel lobby, a middle-aged son and his elderly mother, their faces etched with the same weary pain I knew so well. They told me their story, and it was like listening to an echo of my own. A beloved patriarch, A sudden illness, a last-minute suspicious codicil to the will, and the sudden appearance of the predatory Mr. Graves. They had been bullied and ultimately exhausted into giving up. Forced to watch as their family's legacy was auctioned off by the same smirking dealer Noah had recommended to me, listening to them, my resolve hardened from steel into diamond. This was for them, too. This was for every person this pack of wolves had ever preyed upon. While Ms. Davenport's team worked quietly in the background, issuing subpoenas and gathering a mountain of financial evidence that linked Noah, Graves, and the dealer, my job was to maintain the facade. The pressure was intensifying. Noah was calling almost daily, his voice losing its patient, condescending edge. He started asking for my move-out date, telling me the trust needed to take possession of the apartment to formally appraise it. I could feel the net tightening. His creditors were breathing down his neck. He was getting desperate to liquidate his prize asset. I kept putting him off with believable excuses. Problems with movers, a delay with the friend I was supposedly staying with. Each conversation was a tightrope walk over a canyon. A week into our preparations, Ms. Davenport called me into her office. She laid out the situation with stark clarity. We had them. The evidence was ironclad. The link to the Miller case established a clear pattern of criminal conspiracy. We could file the lawsuit now, she explained, and we would almost certainly win. But it would be a long, ugly war. Graves would use every dirty trick to drag it out for years, trying to bleed me dry. My name, Marcus's name, would be all over the tabloids. Then she offered another path, a surgical strike, a private confrontation where we could present our intents at once, giving them no time to strategize, no room to escape. A move designed not just to win, but to force a swift and unconditional surrender. I thought of the Millers. I thought of Marcus's memory. Public circus was the last thing he would have wanted. I told her to plan the surgical strike. The only question was where. The location had to be not our territory, not theirs. It needed to be a place where Noah felt powerful, but was also incredibly vulnerable. And then it came to me. An article I'd seen in a society blog just days before. It was an announcement for the annual luncheon and board meeting of the Pierce Family Foundation, the charitable organization that had been Marcus's greatest pride. The article proudly named Noah Pierce as the new chairman who would be giving his inaugural address. My heart began to pound. It was perfect. It was a stage. Noah wouldn't just be Noah there. He'd be playing the part of the respectable philanthropist, the worthy son stepping into his great father's shoes. He'd be surrounded by the city's elite, by board members who had respected Marcus for decades. His reputation, the very thing he was trying to build on top of his father's grave, would be on the line. A whisper of scandal in that room would be a social bomb. It was a trap he would never see coming because it was a stage he had built for himself. Ms. Davenport agreed it was the perfect venue. The next day, she drafted a formal, polite letter on my behalf. In it, I, as Marcus's grieving widow, requested the honor of attending the luncheon. I wrote that I wanted to be there to support Noah and to quietly observe the continuation of my beloved husband's charitable legacy. It was a request dripping with sentimental humility. It was a request he couldn't possibly deny without looking like a monster to the entire board. 2 days later, the official invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock. His acceptance was my death warrant. He thought he was granting a final, pitying wish to the woman he had already defeated. He had no idea he was personally inviting his executioner to his own coronation. The date was set. The evidence was compiled into a series of neat, damning binders. All the pieces were in place. In 3 days, Noah would stand up in front of his father's world to claim his inheritance. He was expecting a round of applause. He was going to get a reckoning. The last 24 hours before the luncheon felt like the strange, heavy calm before a hurricane. The city hummed along outside my windows, oblivious. But inside the penthouse, the air itself felt waiting electricity. The frantic energy of the past few weeks, the secret searches, the clandestine meetings, the late-night strategy calls with Ms. Davenport had subsided. All the pieces were now in place. There was nothing left to do but wait for the dawn. I spent the day in a state of focused. I wasn't packing boxes, I was preparing for war. I walked through the apartment home and let the memories wash, not with the agonizing, with a sense of purpose. I touched the worn leather of Marcus's favorite arm. I stood in his study and breathed in the scent of old books and his lingering cologne. This was what I was fighting. Not the monetary value of these things, but the life, the love they represent, his memory. In the afternoon, I laid out my armor for the next day. A simple, elegant sheath dress in a deep charcoal gray. It was the dress Marcus had bought me for our 3rd anniversary. It was understated, powerful, and respectful. It was the last. Wearing it would feel like having him a silent back. I reread the final summary Davenport had sent over, a timeline of Noah's deceit, a flowchart of his conspiracy. The words on the page were cold, hard facts, but they felt like a sacred text, a manuscript of the justice we were about to deliver. A wave of restlessness hit me late in the afternoon. I needed to walk, to feel the solid. I put on a simple coat and sunglasses and walked out into the crisp autumn air of the city. I walked for miles without a destination, just letting the rhythm of the city soothe nerves. As I was heading back, cutting down a quiet side street a few blocks from the apartment, I saw them. It was Noah and Mr. Graves, sitting at a small table outside a cafe. My blood ran cold, and I instinctively ducked into the shadow of a nearby doorway, my heart in my chest. They hadn't seen. I watched them, and a scene of utter discord played out before my eyes. They weren't a team of victors enjoying the spoils. They were a viper's nest. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language was a shout. Graves was rigid with fury, his hand chopping the air in sharp, angry gestures as he spoke. Noah was a portrait of a man crumbling. He was pale, sweating, constantly running a shaking hand through his hair. He looked small, like a child being reprimanded, not a co-conspirator. At one point, Graves slid a phone across the table, showing Noah something on the screen, and I saw a look of pure, unadulterated panic flash across Noah's face. It was clear their alliance, forged in greed, was fracturing under the weight of Noah's desperation. The creditors were closing in. Graves wasn't looking at a partner, he was looking at a liability who was failing to deliver his prize on time. The shark was getting ready to devour the fool. Seeing that, a final calm settled. The tiny voice that whispered, "You're wrong, they're too powerful," went silent. They weren't a monolith of power. They were a fragile, rotting partnership, held together by mutual criminality, and it was about to collapse under the slightest pressure. I walked back to the penthouse, the city lights beginning to sparkle against the twilight sky. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the world that I had fought so hard to kill. Anger and the fear had been burned away, leaving only a serene, absolute certainty. Planning was over. The waiting was done. Tomorrow, I would walk into that luncheon not as a victim, not as the grieving widow. I would walk in as the executor of my husband's final will. I was no longer the storm-tossed as the storm. I walked into the grand ballroom of the St. Regis, and it felt like stepping onto a stage. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and wealth. A low murmur of polite conversation humming beneath a crystal chandelier the size of a small car. Dozens of faces turned to look at me. The city's old guard, men and women who had known Marcus for decades. I saw pity in their eyes, the gentle, dismissive sympathy reserved for the tragic widow. I let them see what they expected to see. I was wearing my charcoal gray dress, my grief, and my resolve, all tailored to fit perfectly. Ms. Davenport was already there, a pillar of calm confidence near the back of the room. We exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Our plan was set. Our forces were in position. Noah was in his element, gliding between tables, accepting handshakes and condolences with a practiced, somber grace. He was the very picture of the dutiful son. When he saw me, his face arranged itself concerned. He rushed to my side, hands in his. He told me how brave I was, how much it would have meant. The hypocrisy was almost breathtaking. I allowed my eyes to fill with tears. I thanked him in a whisper, and I let him lead me to a small table near the front. The final act of my performance had begun. The luncheon was an agonizing affair of bland food and even blander speeches. Finally, the moment arrived. Noah stepped to the podium, tapping the microphone and waiting for the room to fall silent. He began his speech, and it was a masterpiece of hollow sentiment. He spoke of Marcus's legacy, of family values, of the heavy responsibility he now felt to carry on his father's great work with the foundation. His voice was smooth and earnest. To anyone else, he was the perfect heir. To me, every word was a stone, building the monument of his own arrogance. He was basking in the applause, a triumphant smile on his face, when Ms. Davenport stood up. She didn't make a scene. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was a disruption. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and sharp that it sliced through the lingering applause and brought an immediate, curious silence to the room. She introduced herself, Evelyn Davenport, counsel for Mrs. Audrey Pierce. She calmly stated that there was a pressing matter directly impacting the governance of the foundation and the legal standing of its new chairman, a matter the board had a right to be informed of. A ripple of confusion went through the ballroom. Noah's smile froze on his face. He tried to wave her away, telling her this was a private event, not the appropriate venue. Mr. Graves, seated near the podium, jumped to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red, but Ms. Davenport was already in motion. Her associates, positioned around the room, began placing a thin, bound folder in front of each board member. The folders contained everything: a summary of the fraudulent addendum, the PI's report on the Shell Corporation, a signed affidavit from the Miller family, evidence of Noah's catastrophic debts. It was the entire architecture of their crime, laid bare in black and white. But that wasn't the real blow. That was just the opening salvo. As the board members began to read, their faces shifting from confusion to shock, Noah's world was already collapsing. But I had one more secret, the one that had been buried the deepest. I stood up. All eyes, which had been darting between Noah and the papers, now locked on me. I didn't look at Noah. I looked at the board, at the men and women who had called Marcus their friend. My voice, when I spoke, was steady. I told them that Noah's entire claim to his father's estate was predicated on one simple, that he was Marcus's sole blood relative. Then I told them my story, the one I had carried in silence my entire adult life. I told them about being a scared 16-year-old girl, about a baby I had to give up, a son I never. The room was so quiet I could hear the frantic scratching of the society, and then I delivered the final, devastating. I told them that Marcus, in his search for a child to adopt, had, by an impossible twist of fate, found and adopted the son of the baby I had been forced to give away. That Marcus had spent the last years of his life trying to find me, the biological mother of the man who fathered his adopted son, to bring our broken family full circle. "This inheritance is for real family," my stepson said. I just smiled and showed him my DNA test. That's how this story began for you. But for me, it ended like this. I looked directly at Noah for the first time, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. I spoke the final words, my voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. I told them Noah was not my stepson, he was my grandson. Ms. Davenport chose that precise moment to place one last document on the table in front of the lead board member. It was the certified result of a DNA analysis, confirming with 99.9% certainty that I was the paternal grandmother of Noah Pierce. My claim to the Pierce bloodline was not through marriage. It was direct, it was undeniable, and it superseded his. The sound in the room was absolute. A deafening, crushing silence fell over the dozens of shocked faces. The applause was forgotten. The speeches were forgotten. All that was left was the truth, naked and brutal, hanging in the air. Noah stood at the podium, a statue of a broken man. His empire of lies turned to dust at his feet. The silence in that ballroom broke not with a bang, but with 1,000 fractured sounds. A collective gasp from the board members. The scrape of a chair as someone stood up in shock. The frantic, almost silent scratching of the reporter's pen. Noah stood frozen at the podium, his face a horrifying mask of white, slack-jawed He looked from me to the DNA report, then back to me, his eyes finally empty of all their arrogant fire, replaced by the vacant stare of a man whose entire world had just been obliterated. Mr. Graves was already trying to move toward him, to salvage something, but it was too late. The truth was out, and it was a tidal wave that would sweep them all away. I didn't stay to watch the full implosion. Ms. Davenport and I walked out of that ballroom, leaving the chaos behind. In the days that followed, the consequences of that single moment cascaded down upon them, swift and merciless. The board of the foundation immediately moved to suspend Noah's chairmanship pending a full investigation. The Society reporter's story broke online, a sanitized but still damning version of events that set Manhattan's elite buzzing. Faced with an ironclad case for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering, with the Miller family's case now joined to mine, and utterly abandoned by a disgraced Mr. Graves who was fighting for his own career, Noah crumbled. There was no fight left in him. He signed away all claims to the estate. He signed over his shares. He signed everything. A desperate plea to avoid criminal prosecution. The last I heard, his creditors had descended, and he had quietly left the city, a man erased by his own greed. Mr. Graves was disbarred. His partnership with the dealer was exposed, and a string of their past asset liquidation deals came under official review. They had built an empire on the grief of others, and it was dismantled brick by brick. Mr. Abernathy was quietly vindicated, his name cleared in the private legal circles where it mattered most. Justice, when it finally arrived, was total. I won. I got everything back. The penthouse, the security, the legacy. But for a long time, it felt like a hollow victory. I would walk through the quiet, sun-filled rooms and feel the ghosts of all the truths and lies that had lived there. The ghost of the Marcus I knew, and the ghost of the man who kept a terminal diagnosis and the secret from me. The ghost of the innocent little boy Noah once was, and the ghost of the monster, the real he, didn't come from a legal document. It came months later, when I was sorting through a box of Marcus's old photos. I found one of him with Noah, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, sitting on his shoulders at a Thanksgiving parade. They were both laughing, their joy so pure and real it brought tears to my eyes. And that was the final emotional twist in my own heart. I realized my fight hadn't been about destroying my grandson. It was about honoring my husband. Marcus had seen a darkness in Noah, a weakness he feared, and he had tried to protect me from it. But I believe he also saw that laughing little boy and never gave up hope for him. The secret he kept wasn't a betrayal. It was a complicated, imperfect act of love, an attempt to build a family from broken pieces without wanting to cause more. I can never forgive what Noah, the man, did. But looking at that photo, I could find a desperate, broken person. I understood that my true inheritance from Marcus wasn't the money. It was the choice of what to do next. I now run the Pierce Family Foundation, but I have changed its mission. It is now dedicated to providing resources, legal aid, and support to young women in crisis, women who feel lost and are forced to just as I was all those years ago. We help them find their footing, protect their futures, and keep their families. The penthouse is quieter these days, but it no longer feels empty. It's filled with purpose. The stormy sea in the painting behind the desk feels different now. It's no longer a symbol of a hidden secret, but a reminder that you can sail through the most violent of storms and find a calm shore on the other side. This long, painful chapter of my life, which unfolded right here in the heart of Manhattan, has finally closed. But in telling you this, I've realized my story is just one of many. It makes me wonder who is listening to this and what storms you might be facing in your own life. It would bring me some comfort to know how far this story has traveled. If you're willing, let me know in the comments what city or what part of the world you're listening from. Thank you for being the friend who saw me through to the end.